Hi, and welcome to this live reading from My Inner Critic by Christine Bernard, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. On the first wedding I ever attended, I couldn't have been older than 5 or 6. I'd been placed right at the front, my little legs dangling off the edge of the pew. I'd been excited about it all day, but now that I was there, I was nervous. The room went quiet when the vows were spoken, and I'd been so afraid that I would do something to ruin the moment. What if I had an uncontrollable urge to cough or sneeze? What if I clapped when I wasn't supposed to or laughed when nothing was funny? My hands never stopped moving and my legs never stopped swaying as I waited for the priest to finally announce the couple as husband and wife. "I'm scared," I whispered to my mother, who had sat calmly beside me. My mother had always been calm. She had once compared me to a coffee cup that had just been stirred. She said I was the water that kept moving around and around. It was a funny analogy, but one I often considered when stirring my coffee. I was the ocean, she was the lake. "Why are you scared?" she asked. "I'm scared of making a noise," I admitted. When I said the words out loud, they seemed silly. It was one of my earliest memories of hating my inner voice. She took my hand and gave it a squeeze. Afterwards, once outside, I was relieved, as if I'd accomplished something big that day, and after that, I'd allowed myself to have fun. It helped that I was promised a huge serving of the wedding cake and free rein to play outside with the other children. I missed the freedom that early childhood offered to help me forget my problems. The anxiety was always skating on the surface, but it was always easily misplaced by something else back then: a small slice of thickly layered cake, a run through the open fields. It didn't take much for my worry to be replaced with enjoyment. I now no longer had the ability to shake things off the way I used to. The wedding I had just attended in the present day had been beautiful, if maybe a little too perfect. I had once been to a wedding where everyone had worn casual clothes, even the bride and groom, and while some people had called it tacky, it had been the most fun I'd had in a social setting, and by far the most memorable wedding I had attended. There was nothing tacky about this event. I was wearing a blue dress that the shop assistant had called a mixture of cobalt and azure. The shop wasn't anything fancy, and the color descriptions weren't necessary. The dress was blue. There was no need to define it. Still, I now wish I had gone for something lighter, perhaps the sky blue I had almost bought. Everyone around me seemed to have gotten the memo to wear subdued tones, except the woman in red, but she was so outlandish it suited her. Other than her, I was one of the few wearing something so in your face, and while it shouldn't bother me, it did. If there was one thing I hated most, it was standing out. Not that I wanted to be a wallflower either, although that was usually what I felt like. Still, despite the dress, nobody seemed to be paying much attention to me. I wasn't someone who usually stood out from a crowd, unless the crowd was a bunch of supermodels. I was short, so I was easily overlooked. My hair was brown with a slight ginger tone to it, and I always had it cut in a bob. It was barely long enough for me to put in a ponytail, but it looked ridiculous if I did that. Not that I knew this until many years later when I saw a photo of myself from the back. Since then, I'd tried to grow it out, but the in-between stage of hair growth was so frustrating that I'd always end up cutting it back to a bob. Between my hairstyle, my height, and my round owl-like glasses, I often came across as younger than I was. I couldn't do anything about my height, and I had a small panic attack anytime I tried to stick contacts into my eyes. The only thing I could do was grow my hair, but I very much doubted that would do much to change the way others saw me. I gazed at the people around me. I was a confident person until I stood in a group. My tendency to compare myself to others was always more pronounced in formal settings. I tugged on my dress now, wishing I was at home wearing something baggy. I was slim, but not toned. Someone once described me as being skinny fat. I came across as thin and would probably be described as such, but if you were to grab at my stomach, you'd feel squishy lumps between your fingers. My thighs also spilled out when I sat. I was sure it was because I used to be fat, and maybe also because my spirit animal was more sloth than swan. "She actually tore the page right out of the book," a woman in a light peach dress was saying. I'd never seen her before, but she'd somehow gathered a small group around her to tell her story. She fascinated me in a way overly confident people always did. I wouldn't be surprised if nobody in this circle knew her, but that didn't stop her from talking. I wasn't even sure what she was talking about. It was hard to think about anything else other than the man standing to my left. Of all the places he could have chosen to join the circle, I wasn't sure why he had chosen that spot, next to me, the shortest girl there. I didn't usually have a problem with my height, but it was hard not to think about it when I was being compared next to a giraffe. I glanced around the circle. He wasn't even that tall, possibly a head higher than the second tallest in the group, but next to me, he seemed huge. As a short person, I felt as if I was constantly trying to prove myself. It often seemed like everyone had been given a test, and only a select few had been given two. I needed to pass both in order to survive this not-so-little thing called life. I should have worn higher heels, but that would have only be replacing one problem with another. I had tried before, although possibly not too hard, but I had no idea how to walk elegantly in them. It was better to go unnoticed as the short girl than to be noticed as the girl who had no idea how to walk. I was so focused on the man next to me that I hadn't noticed the change in conversation. Peach Dress Girl was no longer talking, and instead Holly, my friend from the office, was. Holly, like Peach Girl, was confident with both friends and strangers. She had a certain way about her that made most people assume that whatever she was saying had to be interesting. Perhaps it was because she seemed so interesting herself. Her bright hair directly in line with her bright personality, and then I heard my name. "Tell them your story," she said to me. My story? I might be close to my 40s, but I was instantly transported back to my school days when I had been caught daydreaming instead of listening to the teacher. I had a shoddy memory, yet I found a way to cling onto the worst memories. Sometimes they felt like they were stuck to me like Post-it notes, but some had been forced on with glue. The more awful the memory, the stronger the glue. "Yeah, tell them about the accident you had, the one where you almost died," she urged. I wasn't sure how the conversation had moved to this, but I wished I'd been paying attention. Everyone in the circle was now watching me. I was probably imagining it, but I was almost certain the group had doubled in size. I had told this story to Holly before, changing my intonations at the most important parts and exaggerating some of the smaller details. In truth, I really had almost died that day, so even the most embellished parts of the story felt real to me. I'd been on a field trip as part of my new job working for an events coordinator, and our bus had skidded on a wet road and fallen off the side. It had rolled down a hill and stopped short by a random gate that seemed to be nowhere else but where the bus had hit it. 3 women had fallen on me, and I'd been squished for a few minutes before we had all made our way out, one by one, through the small open window. Everything had happened in slow motion, and every detail was remembered. It was the closest to death I'd ever come, and while it had happened a long time ago, it made for a good story. But telling that story to an individual I knew well was vastly different to telling a group of people. They weren't all strangers, but that didn't matter. Even a group of friends would have left me speechless. It wasn't necessarily who I was talking to, but rather the number of eyes fixed on me. Judgment when I hadn't asked for it. "Oh, it wasn't a big deal," I said. "Now turn your attention somewhere else." "Not a big deal? It was a huge deal," Holly said. I didn't know what to do with my hands, a mix of cobalt and azure. Who cared? I needed a dress with pockets. My face was warm. I no longer spent time in the sun the way I had as a child, and I was super aware of the loss of elasticity and lines in my face over years of sun exposure. Because of that, my face was pale. It was the worst sort of face to have when you wanted to stop a blush from spreading. Someone gave me a look of pity. "That poor woman," the look said. "Isn't she too old for insecurities?" I was at this event, and the bus rolled off the edge down a mountain, and yeah, so then we hit a gate and all survived. Everyone smiled politely my way. Someone even offered a courteous "wow," which wasn't expressive enough to be real, and then they all turned their attention away from me. Soon, someone else was talking, telling the group about her own near-death experience. It wasn't nearly as horrifying as mine had been, but she was a great storyteller, and her tale received a huge response from everyone listening. I wanted to walk away, but I didn't want it to seem obvious, so I continued to stand there, wishing for pockets, but mostly wanting to disappear. I stepped back and hid behind the giraffe.